And welcome back to our lecture on spring. In this lesson, we're going to be dealing with the second and third movements of spring from Vivaldi's Four Seasons. So let's get right back into it. Now, if you haven't already done so, as before, please just pause this video, click on the link in the description or on the top right of your screen, and listen to the second movement of spring while reading along with the score. The timestamp is in the yellow box in the upper left side of your screens. Please make sure to keep this link open throughout the rest of this lecture. Now that you've listened to the movement, let's go through some basic but very important information. So the key is C sharp minor. We're now in the relative minor of the tonic key of this concerto, which, if you remember, it was E major. In a way, we can see that because we're in the relative minor, the flip side of the tonal coin, the feeling of this movement is precisely the opposite of the first. While the first, E major movement, was bright, cheery, energetic, our second movement is slow, weary, exhausted. And yet, the stanza of poetry which inspired this movement feels anything but slow, weary, and exhausted. And then, on the flowery, pleasant meadow, to the dear murmurs of leafy branches and plants, the goatherd sleeps alongside his faithful dog. How do we reconcile this? Well, that's not entirely for me to decide, and this is where the magic of music, art in general, really reveals itself. How you interpret the poem, the music, and how they interact with one another is really up to you. For myself, I can see the weariness evoked by the key as representing the lethargy of the goatherd and the dog. Perhaps it's been a long day and the key isn't intended to imply sadness, but simply an overwhelming need to rest. Anyways, this is really up for you to decide, so I do encourage you to take some time to think it through for yourself. Now, the RCM describes the form of this movement as simply being two-part structure. The theme is stated, and then it's altered a bit here and there when it comes back around. The theme is largo, very slow tempo, which has an expansive, broad quality to it, which is really demonstrated by the solo part. There's not a ton of activity in this solo part, and it almost feels like the soloist is just crawling, moving, scraping, pushing through molasses, just thick liquid. Now, funnily enough, the meter is 3/4, which would tend to imply some sort of dance-like quality. Because of the meter, we can then intuit that despite the tempo marking, there is still movement, still some sort of forward direction, despite it being very limited by the general sensibilities of the key. So, given that the movement is so short, I highly suggest that you stop the video now and give it another listen, and then we can do some analysis. Okay, so we've got a goatherd sleeping next to his dog in a meadow where leaves are rustling. In the middle here, which I boxed off, we have the calm, even rustling of leaves played by the violins. It's a simple, dotted pattern in thirds. Then we look down and see that Vivaldi wrote one of the greatest viola jokes of all time. The viola plays a barking dog, which, as a violinist, I think is extraordinarily apt. For those violists watching, please don't be angry. Keep watching the video. Now, this bark is what we call ostinato. Italian for obstinate or persistent, ostinato is a rhythmic or melodic pattern which was repeated for an extended period. So if you think of any Ed Sheeran song, where you hear him creating his loops and you hear the same rhythmic motifs persisting away throughout the entire song, that's basically what ostinato is. And we have that here in the viola part. Importantly, these lines do not yield. The dog barking and the leaves rustling do not stop. And you get the sense that this entire scene never really ends. Vivaldi just stops depicting it. In the solo violin line, we have this almost operatic melody, which makes perfect sense since Vivaldi was a prolific writer of opera, as we discussed a couple lectures back. It's this long, almost never-ending vocal line soaring above the white noise below. Now, just in case you didn't notice, this movement has a reduced orchestration. We don't have cello or continuo here. I think this is just so interesting because continuo is really the driving force of a Baroque piece. Harmony is what gives melody direction, and continuo is the physical manifestation of harmony. Getting rid of continuo, therefore, means that there's almost a lost sense to this movement. And it's driven forward only by the 3/4 meter, as we discussed earlier. So now to the third movement. You know the deal with stopping the video and the timestamp on the top left of your screen. So after our C sharp minor sojourn, we've returned to E major and ritornello form. We're also back in Allegro, but this time our meter is different. It's 12/8. It's a compound meter. Now, the compound meter creates this really lilting, dance-like quality which fits the overall rustic feel of this movement. The shepherd's bagpipes festively sound as nymphs and shepherds dance below the beloved sky at the bright arrival of spring. This is the poetic inspiration for this movement, and it's describing basically this party to celebrate the coming of spring. We have bagpipes, dancing, celebration, because spring means new life brought into the world. There's also great cause for celebration because our continuo has returned, and despite having these long notes, it's actually this very cool part in the lower strings. And while the upper strings are evoking dancing, we have this long drone going on in the bottom. It's the bagpipes from the poem. Now, we call this bass pedal point. Pedal point is where a note or a series of notes is sustained through harmony changes occurring in other parts. And that is what gives us this droney feeling. The drone doesn't change to suit the harmonies implied by every little change and shift of implied harmony in the melody. It really beats the rhythm of its own drum. It commands the melody to itself. It's this driving force which sometimes clashes with the melody, but keeps pushing forward no matter what, relentlessly reminding you of the key which this entire movement is based on. In the description, I've also linked a live recording of a violinist named Henning Kragerud performing Spring. It's fantastic, and he really takes these liberties necessary to clearly depict the poetry which Spring is connected to. I hope you enjoy that, and I'll see you next time for our first Bach lecture.